Hello, and welcome to the World of Wirth podcast. My name is Stephen, and this show is about fantasy role playing games, how to run them, how to play them, and cool things you can use to make your fantasy role playing experience more exciting and rewarding. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Today, we are going to talk about the Lost Dungeons of Tonisborg, the second dungeon ever created back in 1973. This book was put together by the Fellowship of the Thing, the same group that put together the Secrets of Blackmore movie, which is essential watching for anyone who plays role playing games. And the first thing I'd like to say about this book, it is not what I thought it would be. It is much more. I purchased the uh, mass publication version because I was mostly interested in the dungeons as a historical artifact. I did not realize that there would be such amazing and fascinating history and such useful tips for dungeon mastering and playing in old school games. So let's get right down to it. We're going to discuss a little bit of the history, and then we're going to dive right into what I consider to be the most important part, which is how to play a dungeon like this and how to play fantasy role-playing games in that old school fashion. And that's the real focus of this show today. So part one is a fascinating history of what the gaming scene looks like at the very beginning. Like I said, some of this I already knew from the Secrets of Blackmore movie. Some of it was new. What really got me, though, was the last paragraph, which is actually written by Greg Svensson. And I quote, Tonisborg Dungeon was a living underworld. As people explored it and things happened, like explosions or denizens being killed by the players, I made changes to the maps and adjustments for the creatures that live there. What an amazing sentiment. From so very long ago, the second dungeon ever made was managed and maintained due to the activities of the players. And again, I know I harp on this a lot in other conversations, but this shows the campaign attitude that existed at the beginning of the hobby and has largely faded away with newer editions of the game and newer versions of these types of games, which is really too bad because the campaign, the ongoing saga of your characters as they adventure and develop and eventually, hopefully, become rulers in their own right. Um, to me, that's one of the greatest parts about this game. It's, the ongoing story that emerges from the things that you do with your friends and their characters. Um, so again, I was excited to see that. The uh, the second part of the introduction has facsimile pictures of the actual dungeon that Svensson made, and these are fascinating. The sheer number of vertical connections in this 10-level dungeon is staggering. I'm also intrigued at how there is a shaft going from the first level all the way down to level 10, and how it's indicated on every other level's map page, even though or if there is no way to access it. It shows a bit of foresight, a bit of planning to lay out these dungeons almost like they were on tracing paper and make sure that they had that verisimilitude, the realism that comes from, I went down this stairway, I went 100 yards that way, and up another stairway, and I found myself 100 yards away from that other spot. So I love the way it works out. Um, I also really appreciate how there are sub levels that are connected to each other and other levels vertically, but are separate from what you might call the main column. And some of these sub levels consist only of a single room or a single passage with a stairway at one end and a pit at the other. The stairway might lead up or down to a different level. Likewise, the pit, or perhaps it's a vertical shaft in the ceiling that leads down from another, or yeah, leads from another level above. Again, of course, that's what we now call a funhouse dungeon, but I can only imagine how exciting it would have been going through this adventure with literally nothing else to compare it to. Part two of the book is an example of play, and I just love this. It immediately begins by showing some very important old school game mechanics. It shows that time passes, torches burn out, your inventory matters, the player characters get tired and need to rest and refresh. The dungeon master has the players pre-roll for different encounters that haven't even come up yet, so that way the DM has the results and he can surprise or otherwise pounce on the players when it becomes necessary, or so they don't what's the expression, he doesn't give it away, what could be a surprise or something that's supposed to be frightening. So he has them roll well in advance of when they would be needed, and of course this builds tension. Another example is that combat does not have to be to the death. And there's also an important dungeon master tip: if you make a mistake, retcon your information and not that of the players. There is a fantastic example of how tactical considerations matter, both in combat and for overcoming obstacles. And there's also a couple of examples that show you don't need to roll initiative right away in an encounter. Just because you encounter a creature that may or may not be hostile, you don't have to roll initiative to begin an interaction. After this, we have a section on how to play in Tonisborg, and I want to read a quote, a paragraph from page 19. It says, Tonisborg is a living dungeon where things change and new things come to dwell between the player's adventures. What this book will do is teach you how to create your own adventures and how to immerse your players in the experience of traditional adventuring, with the end goal of confidently running Tonisborg as your own dungeon. What a great introduction. That I love that, even though this book is about 150 pages, and about 50 pages of it are really dedicated to explaining how the traditional gaming methodology works. And I think that's just fantastic. Um, I also like how this particular paragraph seems to predict, as it were, the 1-1 time method of tracking the calendar in your campaign. So your players and their characters go down into the dungeon, they battle, they grab some loot, and they get back out. And they use that time to heal, to investigate the items they've discovered, and the dungeon uses that time to recover and adapt. Fantastic. But again, this goes on for quite a while. We have a description of all sorts of traditional play methods and tools. Um, Maps are tools for dungeon masters and for players. Maps can be found as treasure. Maps can be used as tactical battle spaces. Dungeons are dangerous, and the dungeon master needs to be fair in how they apply the danger. They talk about using more than one player character, another nod to 1-1 time, and the ongoing nature of the campaign. Specific game master techniques include managing your marching order, room descriptions and diagrams, using strategy in combat, both for the players and for their enemies. The author talks about how foreshadowing is an important tool for building tension, building immersion, and letting the players know that something big is coming up or setting them up for a surprise. And then we also have a section on how to transition your game from the attack portion, where the players are delving into the dungeon, to the retreat part of the adventure, where they're trying to get back out with their loot, and how you can turn that retreat into a running battle to escape the bad guys in the dungeon. There's a very important section on how characters create themselves. This is a big feature of old school gaming in that you roll up your character and you start playing, and you don't worry about what that character's backstory is. It could be as simple as, my character was a farmer and they joined the army and they've been with the army for 3 years and then they got out and now they're a fighter out seeking to make their way in the world. And that's your backstory. You don't need 6 pages, you don't need 10 pages of backstory describing every event that happened as a child, etc., etc. Also, derogatory comments about mudcore notwithstanding, one of the great things in this description is how, and this is in all caps, you don't need rules to customize your character. This is a fantastic point. There are some folks in social media who will go on and on about how old school character classes are all the same. Every fighter is just the same. Every cleric is just the same. And I think that just shows a lack of imagination on their part. Let's see. One of the other really big pieces in here is how, as a dungeon master, you should not worry about planning solutions. Instead, scatter clues and items around in your adventures and let the players figure it out. In my experience, the players will come up with a solution to your problem, most likely a solution that you never even considered. And my personal advice here, when this happens, go ahead and reward your players. Even if they manage to skip right past the most fiendish thing you could imagine, not only does this encourage more creative thinking on the part of the players, it encourages more creative thinking for you as a dungeon master. I have lost count of the number of times my players have decided that some mysterious, half-formed idea that I put together was actually this other very specific thing. Often, something they are deathly afraid of. Remember always, your players will tell you what they want, and you just have to listen and then give it to them good and hard. Finally, there's a great section on how characters die and how this is good. I'll summarize this as it adds danger, excitement, and real anticipation for what comes next. It makes even small accomplishments on the parts of your players and characters meaningful. It creates stories that your players will tell around the campfire. It makes a dangerous world seem more real, and it gives players a chance to try new things, new classes, new races, new approaches, new styles of interaction with other players and with the world. Like I said, there are 30 pages of advice like this, and I have been in the hobby playing RPGs and war games since the early 80s, and I like to think that I knew a lot of this. I probably do or did, but the presentation in this book is fresh and lively. The voice of the writer comes through as that of a mentor passing his knowledge and experience to a young Telemachus. If there is anything I've learned in the past 3 years of doing my own research into the origins of this hobby, it's that I still have plenty to learn, and I am privileged to be able to stand on the shoulders of giants as I do so. Part 3 of the book is the Tonisborg dungeon itself. I'm actually going to stop here, and I'm not going to get into a review of the dungeon proper. I want to play and DM this dungeon, and I want to share the experience of that with you. I'm no 10-foot pole of dungeon reviews. I know this, and I don't pretend otherwise, but I do want to dive into this dungeon in a big way And I really hope that you will hit that like and subscribe button and follow along. Thanks again for listening. This is the World of Worth podcast. My name is Stephen, and I look forward to seeing you soon.